I was standing at my kitchen window with a cup of coffee when I saw her marching across my front lawn like a woman on a mission. And I knew immediately that my peaceful Tuesday morning was about to go sideways. Her name was Brenda Morrison, and she was the self-appointed enforcer of the Pinecrest Meadows Homeowners Association in suburban Denver, Colorado. At 47 years old, she had perfected the art of making everyone's life miserable under the guise of maintaining property values. Her highlighted blonde hair was pulled back in that signature tight ponytail that seemed to pull her whole face back with it. And she wore her usual uniform of yoga pants and an oversized fleece jacket, despite probably never having done yoga in her life. I set my coffee down and headed for the front door, already knowing this was not going to be pleasant. My name is Nathan Parker, and I had made the mistake of buying a house in this neighborhood 6 months ago without fully understanding what I was getting myself into. The house itself was perfect, a beautiful 3-bedroom ranch with a detached garage and a sprawling backyard that backed up to open space. The problem was Brenda and her little gang of HOA board members who seemed to think they owned every blade of grass in the development. I opened the door just as she reached my porch. "Morning, Brenda. What can I do for you?" She did not bother with pleasantries. "Nathan, I need to talk to you about those orange stakes you have all over your front yard. They are unsightly and not in compliance with our community aesthetic guidelines." I glanced at the dozen or so bright orange snow stakes I had carefully placed along the edges of my driveway, walkway, and around the perimeter of my garden wall. It was early November, and while we had not gotten much snow yet, I knew it was coming. The stakes were there to mark the boundaries so the snow plow driver would know where to stop and not damage my property. "Those are snow stakes, Brenda. They're temporary, just for the winter season so the plow doesn't tear up my landscaping." She crossed her arms. "I understand what they are, Nathan, but they're tacky. No one else in the neighborhood has them." "That's because everyone else has driveways that are set back from the street or don't have garden walls near the curb. My driveway is right up against the sidewalk, and I have that decorative stone wall bordering my garden. Without those stakes, the plow driver won't know where the boundaries are." "Well, the HOA covenants specifically state that no temporary structures or markers can be placed in front yards without prior approval from the board. You didn't submit a request." I took a deep breath, trying to keep my cool. "Brenda, these are standard snow stakes. They're used all over Colorado. This isn't a decorative fountain or a shed, they're safety markers. Rules are rules, Nathan. I am going to have to ask you to remove them, or the HOA will be forced to take action." "What kind of action?" "We can fine you $50 per day until they are removed, and if you refuse to pay, we can place a lien on your property." I stared at her, trying to process the absurdity of what she was saying. "You're going to fine me for trying to protect my property from snow plow damage." "I am going to fine you for violating HOA covenants. Now, I am giving you until the end of the week to remove them voluntarily. Have a good day, Nathan." She turned and walked back across my lawn, cutting right through the middle of it instead of using the walkway. I watched her go, feeling my blood pressure rising. This was not the first run-in I had with Brenda. In the 6 months since I had moved in, she had already sent me violation notices for leaving my trash cans out 4 hours too long, for having a garden hose visible from the street, and for painting my mailbox post a shade of brown that was apparently not on the approved color list. I went back inside and called my buddy Mike, who had lived in an HOA community for years before finally escaping to a rural property outside of Boulder. "Dude, she's threatening to fine me for snow stakes," I told him after explaining the situation. Mike laughed. but it was not a happy laugh. That's HOA Karens for you, man. They get a tiny bit of power and it goes straight to their heads. My advice: document everything. Take photos of the stakes, save every email and letter they send you. If this goes south, you'll want a paper trail. I'm not taking them down. That wall cost me $8,000 to have built. It is gorgeous fieldstone masonry, and if the plow hits it, it will be destroyed. Then get ready for a fight. These people don't back down. They'd rather burn the whole neighborhood down than admit they're wrong. I spent the rest of the day researching HOA laws in Colorado. What I found was not encouraging. HOAs in Colorado had broad powers to enforce their covenants, and while there were some protections for homeowners, the process of fighting back was expensive and time-consuming. I also looked up my specific HOA covenants and found the section Brenda was referring to. It was vague enough that she could probably make a case that the snow stakes were a violation, even though that clearly was not the intent of the rule. By Friday, I had not removed the stakes. I was hoping Brenda would just let it go, but I should have known better. On Saturday morning, I woke up to find all of my snow stakes gone. Every single one of them had been removed from my yard. I walked outside in my pajamas and slippers, looking around in disbelief. They had not just pulled them up, they had taken them completely. I checked my garage and around the side of the house, thinking maybe the HOA had pulled them and left them somewhere for me to collect, but there was nothing. They were just gone. I immediately pulled out my phone and started taking pictures of everything. Then I went back inside and sent an email to the HOA board. To the Pinecrest Meadows HOA board, I wrote, "This morning I discovered that the snow stakes I had placed in my yard have been removed without my permission. These stakes were my personal property and were placed on my property. I did not give anyone permission to enter my yard or remove anything from it. I am requesting an immediate explanation and the return of my property. Nathan Parker." I got a response within an hour from Brenda. "Nathan, as discussed, the stakes were in violation of HOA covenants. The board voted to have them removed. The stakes have been disposed of. You were given adequate warning. Please refer to Section 7.3 of the Community Covenants regarding temporary structures. Brenda Morrison, HOA President." I read the email 3 times, my anger building with each pass. They had just admitted to trespassing on my property and stealing my belongings. I called Mike again. "They took them. Like physically came onto your property and removed them." "Yep, and they're admitting it in writing." "Dude, that's theft. You could call the cops." "I don't know if that would help or just make things worse. Let me think about it." I spent the weekend stewing over what to do. Part of me wanted to go buy more stakes and put them right back up, but I knew that would just escalate things. Another part of me wanted to lawyer up immediately, but I was not sure I wanted to spend thousands of dollars on attorney fees over some snow stakes. I decided to wait and see what happened when the snow actually came. Winter in Denver can be unpredictable. Some years we barely get any snow, other years we get buried. That year was shaping up to be a wet one. The first major storm hit in mid-November, dumping 14 inches of snow on the metro area over a 2-day period. The HOA had contracted with a local company called Rocky Mountain Snow Removal to plow all the streets and driveways in our development. I woke up the morning after the storm to the sound of heavy machinery. I looked out my window and saw the big orange plow truck making its way down our street, pushing massive walls of snow to the sides. I watched as it cleared the street, then started on the driveways. The driver was moving fast, probably trying to get through all the properties before people had to leave for work. When he got to my house, I felt a sinking feeling in my stomach. Without the stakes to mark the boundaries, There was no way for him to know where my driveway ended and where my garden wall began. Everything was buried under more than a foot of snow. I pulled on my boots and coat and ran outside, waving my arms and trying to get his attention, but the truck was too loud and he was focused on the plow in front of him. I watched in horror as the plow blade caught the top of my garden wall, which sat about 8 inches above ground level, and ran along the front edge of my garden bed. The sound was awful, a grinding crunch of metal on stone. The plow pushed forward, and the entire section of wall, about 15 feet long, just collapsed. Beautiful fieldstone blocks, each weighing probably 40 or 50 pounds, tumbled forward into the snow. The plow kept going, pushing the broken stones and snow into a jumbled mess. The driver finally noticed something was wrong and stopped. He backed up the truck and got out, looking at the damage with wide eyes. "Holy hell, I'm so sorry, man. I had no idea that wall was there. Everything's covered in snow." I was standing there with my hands on my head, just staring at the destruction. $8,000 worth of custom masonry work gone in seconds. "It's not your fault," I managed to say. "I had stakes marking the boundary, but the HOA made me remove them." The driver walked over to look at the collapsed wall more closely. "Yeah, stakes would have helped. We usually look for those. I'm going to need to report this to my company. You should probably file a claim with your homeowner's insurance." He gave me his company's information and his supervisor's phone number, took some pictures, and then carefully finished clearing the rest of my driveway, giving a much wider berth to where the wall had been. After he left, I spent an hour out in the cold, digging through the snow to assess the full extent of the damage. It was bad. The wall had not just been knocked over. Many of the stones were cracked or broken from the impact of the plow blade. This was not something I could just stack back up. It would need to be completely rebuilt. I went inside and called my insurance company. I explained what had happened, and they opened a claim, giving me a claim number and telling me an adjuster would be out within a few days. Then I called the snow removal company and spoke to the supervisor, a guy named Tom who sounded genuinely apologetic. "We carry liability insurance for exactly this kind of thing," Tom said. "But I have to tell you, if the property wasn't marked and it was buried under snow, we might argue that our driver couldn't reasonably be expected to see it." "I understand that, but the property was marked. I had orange snow stakes all around the wall and driveway. The HOA forced me to remove them, and then the damage happened exactly because they weren't there anymore." There was a pause. "Do you have any documentation of that? Because if the HOA prevented you from marking your property and then damage occurred, that's on them, not us." "I have emails from the HOA president admitting they removed the stakes." "Then you need to file a claim with the HOA's insurance. Send me copies of those emails and I will talk to our insurance company, but I think this is going to land on the HOA." I spent the rest of the day documenting everything. I took dozens of photos of the destroyed wall from every angle. I printed out all my email exchanges with Brenda and the HOA board. I made a timeline of events, from when I had installed the stakes to when they were removed to when the damage occurred. I was building a case, though I still was not sure exactly what I was going to do with it. The insurance adjuster came out on Wednesday. His name was Rick, and he was a middle-aged guy with a permanent squint from years of working outdoors. He walked around the damage, took his own photos, and made notes on a tablet. "So walk me through this again," he said. "You had the wall, you marked it with stakes, the HOA removed the stakes, then the plow hit it." "Exactly." "And you have documentation of the HOA removing the stakes." I showed him the printed emails on my phone. He read through them carefully, taking pictures of the emails with his own phone. Okay, here's what's going to happen. I am going to put this claim on hold pending further investigation. This is a liability issue, not a standard property damage claim. If the HOA's actions directly led to this damage, then their insurance should cover it, not yours. You need to file a claim with the HOA's insurance carrier. How do I do that? You'll need to get the information from the HOA board. They're required to carry insurance for exactly these kinds of situations. Send them a formal demand letter explaining what happened and stating that you're holding them responsible for the damage. I did not like the idea of having to deal with Brenda again, but I did not see another option. That evening, I drafted a formal letter. I kept it professional and factual, laying out the timeline of events and attaching copies of all the relevant documentation. I stated that I was holding the HOA responsible for the damage and requesting the contact information for their insurance carrier so I could file a claim. I sent it via certified mail and also emailed a copy to Brenda and the entire HOA board. The response came faster than I expected, but it was not what I hoped for. Brenda called me the next evening, her voice dripping with condescension. "Nathan, I received your little letter and I have to say, I'm disappointed. You're trying to blame the HOA for your own failure to maintain your property. The snow plow damage is not our responsibility. Brenda, with all due respect, you admitted in writing that you removed my snow stakes. Those stakes were there specifically to prevent this exact type of damage. You removed them, the damage happened. That's a direct cause and effect. We removed the stakes because they were in violation of our covenants. You were warned. If you had chosen to remove them yourself when we first asked, you could have worked out an alternative solution." "What alternative solution? You told me I couldn't have any markers in my yard." "That's not our problem, Nathan. You chose to build a wall close to the street. You chose to put in landscaping that's difficult to maintain. Those were your choices, and now you're experiencing the consequences. The HOA is not responsible for your poor planning." I could feel my temper rising, but I tried to keep my voice level. "I am not asking you to take my word for it, Brenda. I am asking you to provide me with your insurance carrier's information so they can investigate and make a determination. That's how this works. I will discuss it with the board, but I can tell you right now, we're not going to just roll over on this. You've been nothing but a problem since you moved into this neighborhood, Nathan. Always pushing back against the rules, always thinking you're special. Well, you're not. The rules apply to everyone equally. The rules should make sense, Brenda, and they shouldn't result in thousands of dollars of property damage. We'll be in touch." She hung up. I sat there staring at my phone, feeling a mix of anger and frustration. This woman was unbelievable. Mike had been right. She would rather burn everything down than admit she was wrong. A week went by with no response from the HOA. I sent a follow-up email, then another one. Finally, I got a response from Brenda with the insurance information. The HOA was covered by a company called Community Shield Insurance. I immediately filed a claim, sending them all my documentation and a detailed explanation of what had happened. The claims adjuster from Community Shield, a woman named Patricia, called me a few days later. She sounded professional but cautious. "Mr. Parker, I have reviewed your claim and the documentation you provided. I need to be upfront with you. This is a complex situation. The HOA is arguing that they had a right to remove the stakes under the terms of the covenants, and that the damage was caused by the snow plow company, not by their actions. But if they hadn't removed the stakes, there wouldn't have been any damage. The stakes were there specifically to prevent this. I understand your argument, and I'm not saying you're wrong. What I am saying is that this is likely going to require a more thorough investigation. I am going to need to interview the HOA board members, get statements from the snow plow company, and review all the relevant documents. This could take some time. How much time? Could be a few weeks, could be a couple months. These things don't move quickly. Meanwhile, I was stuck with a destroyed garden wall and winter was just getting started. I got quotes from 3 different masonry companies to rebuild the wall. The estimates ranged from $7,500 to $9,500. The original wall had cost $8,000, but now there was additional labor involved in removing all the broken stones and starting fresh. I went with a company called Stone Age Masonry, run by a guy named Carlos who had done excellent work on a friend's fireplace. He said he could start in early December, but wanted a deposit up front. I paid him $3,000, figuring I would get it back eventually from someone's insurance. While I was dealing with all of this, Brenda was not letting up on other fronts. I got a violation notice because my trash cans were visible from the street on a non-collection day, even though they were tucked behind a bush. I got another notice because there were icicles hanging from my gutters, which apparently violated some vague clause about property maintenance. Each notice came with a threat of fines if I did not comply within a certain time frame. I started attending HOA board meetings, which were held the first Tuesday of every month in the community center. The November meeting had already passed by the time all this started, so I went to the December meeting. There were maybe 15 other homeowners there, most of them looking bored or resigned. Brenda sat at the front table with the other board members. A nervous-looking guy named Dennis, who was the treasurer, a woman named Carol, who was the secretary, and another woman named Yolanda, who was listed as a member at large. Brenda ran the meeting like a dictator. She went through old business, approved the minutes from the last meeting, and then opened up new business. I raised my hand. "Yes, Nathan." She said my name like it tasted bad. "I'd like to discuss the situation with my property damage." The HOA removed stakes from my yard that were there to protect my garden wall, and then the wall was destroyed by a snow plow. I've filed a claim with the HOA's insurance, but I haven't heard anything definitive. I'd like to know where the board stands on this. Brenda's face tightened. The board's position is that we acted within our authority under the covenants. The damage to your wall was caused by the snow plow company, not by the HOA. We're cooperating with the insurance investigation, but we are not accepting liability. But you admit you removed the stakes. We removed items that were in violation of our community standards. That's part of our job as board members. An older man in the back raised his hand. "Wait, hold on. You're saying the HOA went onto someone's property and removed things without their permission?" Brenda's jaw clenched. "We have the authority to enforce compliance with our covenants. Sometimes that means taking direct action." Another woman spoke up. "That doesn't sound right. Don't you have to go through a formal process before you can do something like that?" The process was followed. Nathan was given a warning and a deadline to comply. He chose not to comply, so the board took action. I shook my head. "The action was trespassing and theft, Brenda. You came onto my property and took my belongings. They were temporary markers that were in violation of our rules." "This is not theft." The older man in the back stood up. "I've lived in this neighborhood for 12 years, and I've never seen the HOA go onto someone's property and remove things. That's crossing a line." A few other people murmured in agreement. I could see Brenda getting flustered, which was unusual for her. She was used to having complete control of these meetings. If anyone else has concerns about how the board operates, you're welcome to run for a position in the next election. Until then, the current board is acting within its authority. Now, if there's no other new business, I move to adjourn the meeting. Dennis quickly seconded, and before anyone else could say anything, Brenda banged her gavel and declared the meeting over. People filed out, some of them shooting sympathetic looks my way. The older man who had spoken up came over to me. "Hey, I'm Gerald Winters. I live over on Aspen Court. What she did to you is not right. I've been dealing with her nonsense for years, but she's getting worse. You should talk to a lawyer. I'm hoping the insurance will sort it out, but if not, that might be my next step. There's a few of us who have been talking about trying to get Brenda removed from the board, or at least voted out in the next election. If you're interested, we should exchange numbers." I gave Gerald my contact info. It was nice to know I was not alone in this, even if I was not sure I wanted to get involved in HOA politics. I just wanted my wall fixed and to be left alone. December turned into January. The insurance investigation dragged on. Patricia from Community Shield called me every couple weeks with updates, but there never seemed to be much progress. They had interviewed Brenda and the board members, who all stuck to the story that they had acted appropriately. They had talked to Tom from the snow removal company, who had told them what he told me, that without stakes or markers, his driver had no way to know the wall was there under the snow. Carlos finished rebuilding my wall just after New Year's. It looked beautiful, exactly like the original. He had even managed to salvage some of the undamaged stones and incorporate them into the new construction. The total cost came to $8,700. I paid the remaining balance, bringing my out-of-pocket expense to a number that made me feel sick every time I thought about it. In mid-January, I got a call from Patricia with what she said was good news. "Mr. Parker, after reviewing all the evidence and conducting our investigation, Community Shield has decided to accept liability for the damage to your wall. We're going to settle your claim." I felt a wave of relief wash over me. That's great. What does that mean exactly? We're offering a settlement of $8,700, which matches the cost of the repair work you've already had done. We'll need you to sign a release saying that this settles the matter and you won't pursue any further claims related to this incident. What about the original stakes that were taken? Those cost me about $150. I can add that to the settlement. So $90,000 even. You mean $9,050? Right, sorry, $9,050. I'll send you the paperwork. Once you sign and return it, we'll process the payment within 10 business days. I should have felt victorious, but mostly I just felt exhausted. This whole ordeal had taken 2 months, caused me endless stress, and forced me to front almost $9,000 while I waited for the insurance to come through. But at least it was over, or so I thought. The check from Community Shield arrived in early February. I deposited it immediately and felt like I could finally put this nightmare behind me. But then, a week later, I got a letter from the HOA. It was not from Brenda this time, but from a law firm, Thompson and Associates, attorneys at law. The letter informed me that the Pinecrest Meadows HOA was placing a lien on my property for unpaid fines totaling $3,200. According to the letter, I had accumulated multiple violations over the past several months, each carrying a $50 per day fine. The violations included the snow stakes, the visible trash cans, the icicles on my gutters, and several other things I had never even been properly notified about. I read the letter 3 times, my blood pressure rising with each pass. This was retaliation, pure and simple. Brenda was punishing me for filing the insurance claim and making the HOA look bad. I immediately called the law firm and asked to speak to the attorney handling the case. I got routed to a young-sounding guy named Jeffrey Thompson. "Mr. Parker, I represent the Pinecrest Meadows HOA." My client has documented numerous violations of the community covenants, and you've failed to pay the associated fines. If you don't pay the outstanding balance within 30 days, the HOA will proceed with filing the lien. These fines are bogus. Half of these violations I was never even properly notified about, and the ones I was notified about were either resolved or were not actually violations. According to my client's records, you were sent written notices for each violation. Your client is lying. Or at least, she's stretching the truth beyond recognition. This is retaliation for the insurance claim. That's a serious accusation, Mr. Parker. Do you have any evidence of that? The timeline speaks for itself. I file a claim against the HOA's insurance. The insurance finds them liable, and suddenly, I'm being hit with thousands of dollars in retroactive fines. Come on. The fines are not retroactive. They accrued over time based on documented violations. Now, I'm required to give you notice of your right to appeal these fines through the HOA's internal process. You have 14 days from the date of this letter to file a written appeal with the board. I hung up and immediately called Mike. After I explained the situation, there was a long silence on the other end. Dude, you need a lawyer. Like yesterday. This is beyond just annoying HOA stuff. They're coming after you legally now. I don't want to spend thousands of dollars on lawyer fees. You might not have a choice. If they place a lien on your house, that's going to affect your ability to sell or refinance. It goes on your title. You need to take this seriously. I spent the weekend researching attorneys who specialized in HOA disputes. It was a depressing process. Most of them wanted retainers of $5,000 or more just to get started. I found one guy, Martin Chen, who offered a free initial consultation. I scheduled a meeting for the following Tuesday. Martin's office was in a small building in Lakewood, just west of Denver. He was younger than I expected, maybe mid-30s, but he had good reviews online and seemed to know his stuff. I brought all my documentation, the emails, the photos, the timeline, the insurance settlement, and the letter from Thompson and Associates. He spent about 30 minutes reviewing everything, occasionally asking questions or making notes. Finally, he leaned back in his chair and gave me a frank assessment. Okay, so here's the situation. The HOA is clearly retaliating against you for the insurance claim. The problem is proving that in a way that will matter legally. HOAs have broad discretion to enforce their covenants, and unless you can show that they're applying the rules inconsistently or in bad faith, it's hard to challenge them. But these fines are ridiculous. $50 a day for having trash cans visible. That's insane. It might be insane, but if it's in the covenants, they can enforce it. However, there are some things working in your favor. First, if you weren't properly notified of the violations, they can't fine you for them. Second, if they're applying rules to you that they're not applying to other homeowners, that's selective enforcement and you can challenge it. Third, if the fines are excessive or unreasonable, you might be able to argue that in court. What would it cost to fight this, if we go to court? Probably $10,000 to $15,000, maybe more depending on how hard they fight back. If we can settle it before that, maybe $5,000. But here's the thing. Even if you win, you might not recover your attorney fees unless the judge specifically awards them, which is not guaranteed. I felt my stomach sink. So basically, even if I'm right, I could end up spending more in legal fees than the fines themselves. Welcome to HOA disputes. It's a rigged game. The HOA has access to all the homeowners' dues to fund their legal battles. Individual homeowners have to pay out of pocket. That's why HOAs usually win these fights, not because they're right, but because they can outlast you financially. So what do you recommend? Martin thought for a moment. Let's start with the appeal process. It's free and it might resolve this without having to go to court. I can help you draft the appeal. We'll lay out all the reasons why these fines are improper, and we'll make it clear that you're prepared to fight this legally if necessary. Sometimes, just showing that you're serious and have an attorney involved is enough to make them back down. And if they don't back down, then we escalate. But let's cross that bridge when we come to it. I hired Martin on a limited scope basis to help me with the appeal. He charged me $1,500, which was painful but seemed necessary. We spent a couple hours going through each alleged violation and building a case for why the fines should be dismissed. For the snow stakes, we argued that the HOA had violated my property rights by removing them without due process. For the trash cans, we provided photos showing that at least 6 other houses in the neighborhood had trash cans in similar positions, demonstrating selective enforcement. For the icicles, we argued that naturally occurring ice formation could not reasonably be considered a maintenance violation. And so on. Martin drafted a detailed appeal letter that was professional but firm. It concluded by noting that if the fines were not dismissed, I would have no choice but to pursue legal action for harassment, selective enforcement, and violation of my property rights. We submitted the appeal to the HOA board with a copy to Thompson and Associates. The next HOA board meeting was in early February. According to the bylaws, they had to hear my appeal at the next scheduled meeting, which meant I would get my answer soon. I showed up at the community center with Martin. The room was more crowded than usual. Word had gotten around about my situation, and several neighbors were there to see what would happen. Brenda looked surprised and not pleased to see Martin with me. "Mr. Parker, I see you've brought an attorney." "That's not necessary for a simple appeals hearing." Martin spoke before I could. "Mr. Parker has the right to have legal representation at any hearing that could result in financial penalties against him. We're here to present his appeal of the fines levied by the HOA." Brenda's mouth pressed into a thin line, but she nodded. "Fine. We'll hear the appeal under new business." The meeting dragged through all the usual boring stuff: budget reports, landscaping contracts, a lengthy discussion about whether the community center should get new carpet. Finally, we got to my appeal. Martin stood and presented our case. He was calm, professional, and thorough. He walked through each violation, explained why the fines were improper, and presented the evidence of selective enforcement. He finished by noting that the insurance company had already found the HOA liable for the wall damage, which undermined their claim that the snow stakes were improperly placed. When he finished, Brenda conferred quietly with the other board members for a few minutes. Then she cleared her throat. "The board has reviewed Mr. Parker's appeal. While we appreciate his concerns, we find that the violations were legitimate and that the fines were properly assessed. However, in the interest of community harmony, we're willing to reduce the total amount to $1,000 as a one-time courtesy. Mr. Parker will have 30 days to pay this reduced amount." I started to stand up angry, but Martin put a hand on my arm and shook his head. He stood instead. "Let the record show that Mr. Parker rejects this offer and maintains that no fines are owed. The HOA has failed to demonstrate that Mr. Parker was properly notified of all alleged violations and has failed to address the clear evidence of selective enforcement. If the HOA proceeds with attempting to collect these fines or place a lien on Mr. Parker's property, he will file suit in district court. Thank you for your time." We walked out, leaving a room full of murmuring neighbors behind us. Outside, Martin turned to me. "That went about as expected. They're not going to back down, which means we need to decide what you want to do next." I'm not paying $1,000 for violations I didn't commit. What are my options? We file suit. We'll ask for a declaratory judgment that the fines are improper, an injunction preventing them from placing a lien, and potentially damages for harassment and violation of your rights. It's going to be expensive and time-consuming, but based on what we have, I think we've got a decent case. Let's do it. Martin filed the lawsuit the following week in Jefferson County District Court. We sued the Pinecrest Meadows HOA, Brenda Morrison in her capacity as HOA president, and the other board members. The complaint laid out everything that had happened, from the snow stakes to the wall damage to the retaliatory fines. We asked for actual damages of $9,050, which was what I had had to pay out of pocket before the insurance reimbursed me, plus attorney fees and costs, plus a declaration that the fines were improper. The HOA responded by hiring a bigger law firm out of Denver, Carlson and Reed, which specialized in representing HOAs. Their attorney, a woman named Susan Carlson, filed a motion to dismiss the case, arguing that I had failed to exhaust the HOA's internal dispute resolution process. It was a procedural argument meant to delay things. Martin opposed the motion, pointing out that we had gone through the appeal process and it had been denied. The judge agreed with us and denied the motion to dismiss. The case would move forward. Discovery was a nightmare. Both sides sent requests for documents, interrogatories, and requests for admission. I had to go through years of HOA records, emails, meeting minutes, and financial statements. The HOA had to produce records showing how they had handled violations for all homeowners in the neighborhood, which was what we needed to prove selective enforcement. And that's where things got interesting. When we received the HOA's records, Martin and I spent a weekend going through them with a fine-tooth comb. What we found was shocking. Brenda had been issuing violations and fines almost exclusively to a handful of homeowners, including me, while ignoring similar or worse violations by others. We found dozens of examples. Houses with trash cans visible year-round, properties with peeling paint, yards with dead grass, driveways with oil stains. None of them had been cited for violations, while I had been hit for the most minor infractions. Even more damning, we found emails showing that Brenda had specifically targeted me after I had pushed back on her first couple of violation notices. In one email to Carol, the secretary, Brenda had written, "Nathan Parker thinks he doesn't have to follow the rules. We need to make an example of him so other homeowners know we're serious." Martin was grinning when he showed me that email. "This is gold. This is exactly what we need. She's admitting to selective enforcement and harassment in writing." We submitted the evidence in our motion for summary judgment, asking the judge to rule in our favor without a trial based on the undisputed facts. Susan Carlson opposed it, but her opposition was weak. There was no way to explain away those emails or the clear pattern of selective enforcement. The hearing on the motion was scheduled for late April. I took the morning off work and met Martin at the courthouse. It was my first time being in a courtroom for my own case, and I was nervous. The judge was a woman named Judge Patricia Holloway, who had a reputation for being no-nonsense. Martin presented our case, walking through the timeline, the evidence of selective enforcement, and the retaliatory nature of the fines. Susan Carlson argued that HOAs had broad discretion, and that there was no proof the actions were retaliatory rather than just diligent enforcement. Judge Holloway listened to both sides, asked a few pointed questions, and then said she would take the matter under advisement and issue a ruling within 2 weeks. Those 2 weeks felt like forever. I kept checking the court's website for updates. Finally, on a Friday afternoon in early May, the ruling was posted. I was at work, but I immediately pulled it up on my computer. Judge Holloway had ruled in my favor on every single point. She found that the HOA had engaged in selective enforcement, that the fines were retaliatory, and that the HOA had violated my rights by removing the snow stakes without due process. She ordered the HOA to pay me $9,050 in actual damages, plus my attorney fees and costs, which totaled about $12,000 at that point. She also issued a permanent injunction barring the HOA from attempting to collect any of the disputed fines or place a lien on my property. But the ruling went even further. Judge Holloway had some harsh words for Brenda and the HOA board. She wrote that their actions represented a troubling abuse of the authority granted to homeowners associations, and that board members who use their positions to harass and retaliate against homeowners are acting beyond the scope of their authority and may be personally liable for their actions. That last part was important. Susan Carlson had argued that the individual board members, including Brenda, were protected from personal liability. Judge Holloway had rejected that argument, at least with respect to actions taken in bad faith or outside their authority. Martin called me right after the ruling was posted. "Congratulations, Nathan. This is a complete victory. The HOA has to pay you everything, plus my fees. And the language in the ruling about personal liability means that if they appeal this, Brenda and the others could be on the hook personally." Will they appeal? They might, but I doubt it. This ruling is solid, and if they appeal and lose, they could end up owing even more in fees and costs. My guess is they'll pay up and hope this goes away quietly. He was right. 2 weeks later, Susan Carlson reached out to Martin to discuss settlement. Even though we had won the motion, there were still some technical issues about the amount of fees and costs that needed to be resolved. Rather than dragging it out further, they offered to pay $23,000 to settle everything. The $9,050 in damages, $12,000 in attorney fees, and an extra $2,000 to cover additional costs, and to make sure I would sign a release. Martin advised me to take it. "You've won. The money will cover everything you spent, plus all my fees, and you'll come out ahead. If we keep fighting over every dollar, we're just going to rack up more legal bills and it becomes a war of attrition again." I agreed. We settled the case in mid-May. The check arrived a week later, and I deposited it with a feeling of genuine satisfaction. I paid Martin his fees, and I still had about $11,000 left over. It was not about the money, though. It was about the principle. Brenda and her little HOA dictatorship had tried to bully me, and they had lost. But I was not done yet. At the next HOA meeting, which I made sure to attend, the room was packed. Word of the lawsuit and the ruling had spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. Gerald Winters and several other homeowners who had been on the receiving end of Brenda's enforcement actions were there. So were a bunch of people who just wanted to see what would happen. Brenda looked tired and defensive. She opened the meeting and tried to move through the agenda quickly, but Gerald raised his hand during old business. I moved that we add a discussion of board member conduct to tonight's agenda. Someone quickly seconded. Brenda tried to shut it down, but other people started speaking up, and eventually she had no choice but to allow it. Gerald stood up. "I think we all know why we're here. The HOA just lost a major lawsuit because of the actions of our board president. This has cost the association thousands of dollars and has created a hostile environment in our neighborhood. I'm calling for Brenda Morrison to resign from the board, effective immediately." The room erupted in discussion. Some people were nodding in agreement, others looked uncomfortable. Brenda's face turned red. This is outrageous. I've served this community for 4 years. One lawsuit doesn't negate all the work I've done to maintain our property values and enforce our standards. Another homeowner, a woman I did not know, stood up. Brenda, I've lived here for 6 years and I've watched you become more and more controlling. You're not enforcing standards, you're harassing people who don't bow down to you. The judge said as much in her ruling. Carol, the secretary, spoke up hesitantly. Maybe Brenda's right that we should consider this more carefully. We don't want to make a rash decision. Gerald shook his head. This isn't rash. The judge found that Brenda engaged in selective enforcement and retaliation. She used her position to go after Nathan because he stood up to her. That's an abuse of power, and it's exactly why she should resign. Dennis, the treasurer who had been silent through most of this, cleared his throat. Actually, I agree with Gerald. Brenda, I've been concerned about some of your decisions for a while now. This lawsuit was a disaster for the HOA's finances, and it was completely avoidable. If you had just let Nathan keep his snow stakes, none of this would have happened. Brenda looked betrayed. Dennis, you voted with me on every decision. I voted with you because I thought you knew what you were doing. But after reading the judge's ruling and seeing all the evidence that came out in discovery, I realize I was wrong. You were targeting Nathan and a few other people while giving your friends a pass. That's not how an HOA is supposed to work. The debate went on for another 20 minutes. It got heated at times, with Brenda defending herself and others calling for her resignation. Finally, Yolanda, the member-at-large who had been quiet through the whole thing, spoke up. I move that we hold a vote of no confidence in Brenda Morrison as HOA president. If the vote passes, she will be removed from her position, and we'll hold a special election for a new president. The motion was seconded. Brenda tried to argue that this was not proper procedure, but Carol checked the bylaws and confirmed that a vote of no confidence was allowed. They called for a vote of all homeowners present. There were 32 people in the room besides the board members. 28 voted in favor of removing Brenda. 4 voted against or abstained. Brenda stood up, her face a mask of fury and humiliation. Fine. You want me gone, I'm gone. But don't come crying to me when this neighborhood goes downhill because no one is willing to enforce the rules. She grabbed her bag and stormed out, slamming the community center door behind her. The room was silent for a moment, then Gerald started clapping. Others joined in. It was not a celebration exactly, more like a collective sigh of relief. The board quickly reorganized. Dennis agreed to serve as interim president until a special election could be held. Yolanda volunteered to form a committee to review the HOA's enforcement policies and recommend changes to make them more fair and consistent. Several people, including Gerald, said they would run for the board in the next election. I left that meeting feeling like a weight had been lifted. The financial side of things was resolved, and Brenda was no longer in a position to make my life miserable. But there was still one more piece of unfinished business. A few days after Brenda was removed from the board, I got a call from a Detective Sarah Mills with the Jefferson County Sheriff's Office. She said she wanted to talk to me about an incident involving the HOA. I invited her to come to my house that evening. Detective Mills was a professional-looking woman in her 40s with short, dark hair and sharp eyes. She showed me her badge and we sat down in my living room. Mr. Parker, I'm investigating a complaint related to the Pinecrest Meadows Homeowners Association. Specifically, I'm looking into whether any criminal activity occurred when your property was removed from your yard back in November. I was surprised. I didn't file a police report about that. No, but someone else did. After the story about your lawsuit got out, several of your neighbors contacted our office with concerns. One of them, a Mr. Gerald Winters, filed a formal complaint alleging that the HOA board committed theft and criminal trespass when they removed your snow stakes. I mean, they did take my property without permission, and they admitted it in writing. Detective Mills nodded. That's what I wanted to talk to you about. Can you walk me through what happened and provide me with copies of any relevant documentation? I spent the next hour going through the whole story again, showing her the emails, the photos, the timeline. She took notes and made copies of everything. When we were done, she sat back and thought for a moment. Okay, here's the situation. Technically, what the HOA board did could be considered theft and criminal trespass. However, these cases are tricky because HOAs often argue that they have authority to enter properties for enforcement purposes. That said, the fact that they removed personal property, not just corrected a violation, makes this different. And the fact that a judge has already found their actions were improper and retaliatory strengthens the case. So, what happens now? I'm going to recommend that the district attorney file charges. It will be up to them whether to pursue it, and if they do, what charges to file. Given that this was decided in civil court and Miss Morrison is no longer in a position of authority, the DA might decide that criminal charges aren't necessary. But there's a decent chance they'll at least want to talk to her and the other board members. I did not hear anything for a few weeks. Then in late June, I got a call from Detective Mills again. She said the DA had decided to file misdemeanor charges against Brenda Morrison for theft and criminal trespass. The other board members were not being charged since they had not been directly involved in removing the stakes. She'll get a summons to appear in court. Most likely, given her lack of criminal history, she'll be offered a plea deal. Probably some community service, maybe a fine, and the charges could be dismissed if she completes probation. I'm not looking to ruin her life. I just wanted her held accountable. That's reasonable. And honestly, the fact that there are criminal charges at all sends a message to other HOA board members that they can't just do whatever they want. Brenda's court case played out over the next few months. I did not follow it closely, but through the neighborhood grapevine, I heard that she had taken a plea deal. She pleaded guilty to criminal trespass, the theft charge was dropped, and she was sentenced to 40 hours of community service and a year of probation. As part of the deal, she also had to resign from any HOA board positions and could not serve on an HOA board during her probation period. By the end of summer, life in Pinecrest Meadows had settled into a new normal. Dennis had done a good job as interim president, and in the special election, Gerald Winters was elected as the new president. One of his first acts was to revise the enforcement policies, creating a clear process for violations that included proper notice, an opportunity to cure, and an independent review before fines could be assessed. He also put together a committee to review the covenants and recommend changes to eliminate vague or unreasonable rules. I installed new snow stakes in late October, this time with prior approval from the board, as required by the new process. Gerald personally came by to look at them and said they were fine. When winter came and the snow started falling again, the plow driver carefully avoided my wall. By that point, there were stakes in front of several other houses too. People had realized they were a good idea. I ran into Brenda once, in the grocery store in early December. We made eye contact across the produce section. She looked away quickly and hurried off in the other direction. I felt a brief moment of pity for her. She had put so much of her identity into being HOA president, into having that little bit of power and control, and now it was all gone. But then I remembered the months of harassment, the destroyed wall, the stress and expense of fighting back, and the pity faded. She had brought it on herself. Life went on. I threw a barbecue in my backyard in the spring, inviting Gerald and several other neighbors who had supported me through the whole ordeal. We stood around drinking beers and admiring my garden wall, which had survived the winter intact. Someone made a joke about putting up a plaque commemorating the Great HOA War of 2024-2025, and we all laughed. I ended up staying in that house for another 3 years before taking a job that required relocating to Phoenix. When I sold the house, I made a good profit. The new owners seemed nice, and I gave them a brief warning about HOA drama, but assured them that the current board was reasonable. As I drove away from Pinecrest Meadows for the last time, I looked back at the house and the carefully maintained garden wall. It had cost me a lot of time, money, and stress, but I had stood my ground and won. Sometimes that is what matters most. Looking back on the whole experience, I learned a few important lessons about dealing with HOAs. First, document everything. Every conversation, every email, every violation notice. Take photos and keep records. If things go wrong, that documentation is your lifeline. Second, know your rights. HOAs have power, but it is not unlimited. They have to follow their own rules and they have to treat homeowners fairly. Third, do not be afraid to fight back when you are right. Yes, it is expensive and time-consuming, but sometimes principle matters. And finally, you are not alone. In most HOA communities, there are other people who are fed up with overzealous board members and unreasonable enforcement. Find those people and work together. There is strength in numbers. The whole ordeal taught me more than I ever wanted to know about homeowners associations, property rights, and the American legal system. It also taught me something about myself. I am not someone who backs down when I know I am right, even when it would be easier to just pay the fine and move on. That stubbornness cost me sleep, money, and peace of mind for almost a year. But in the end, it also gave me something valuable, the satisfaction of knowing I stood up to a bully and won. As for Brenda, I heard through the grapevine that she moved out of Pinecrest Meadows about a year after everything went down. Apparently the neighborhood had become too uncomfortable for her after the lawsuit and the criminal charges. I do not know where she ended up, and I do not particularly care. I hope she learned something from the experience, but I am not holding my breath. People like her rarely change. They just find new places to exercise their need for control, new people to push around, until eventually they push too hard and face consequences again. The HOA board under Gerald's leadership turned out to be everything Brenda's board was not. They were reasonable, transparent, and focused on actual community improvement rather than petty enforcement. They repainted the community center, updated the playground equipment, and organized social events that brought neighbors together. The atmosphere in the whole neighborhood improved. People felt like they were part of a community again, not subjects of a dictatorship. I sometimes wonder what would have happened if I had just taken down the snow stakes when Brenda first asked. Would I have avoided all the drama, the destroyed wall, the lawsuit, the stress? Maybe. But I also would have been giving in to unreasonable authority, setting a precedent that would have invited more harassment down the road. Sometimes you have to draw a line and defend it, even when it is just about orange stakes in your yard. The insurance settlement and lawsuit recovery money ended up being put to good use. I used part of it to redo my back patio, turning it into a beautiful entertainment space with a built-in grill, a pergola, and comfortable seating. I made sure to get HOA approval for all of it, of course, but under the new board that was just a formality. I spent many enjoyable evenings out there over the next few years, hosting friends and neighbors, and I always felt a little bit of pride knowing that the space had been funded, in a roundabout way, by Brenda's overreach and the subsequent justice. My story spread beyond just my neighborhood. Several local news outlets picked it up after the court ruling came down, framing it as a cautionary tale about HOA abuse and a homeowner fighting back. I did a couple interviews, always emphasizing that I was not anti-HOA in general, just anti-abuse. HOAs serve an important function in maintaining property values and managing common areas. The problem is when board members forget that they are supposed to serve the community, not rule over it. Other homeowners from around Colorado reached out to me asking for advice about their own HOA disputes. I was not a lawyer and could not give legal advice, but I shared my experience and encouraged them to stand up for their rights while also being strategic and documenting everything. Martin Chen, my attorney, told me he saw an uptick in HOA dispute cases after my story went public. Apparently, it had given people hope that fighting back was possible. In the end, the whole saga reinforced something I had always believed, but had never really tested: that the system, while imperfect, does work if you are willing to use it. I had access to the courts. I had the ability to hire an attorney. I had evidence to support my case, and I had a judge who was willing to look at that evidence fairly and rule based on the law. Not everyone is that fortunate, and I am aware of my privilege in being able to fight back the way I did. But I also hope my story encourages others to stand up when they are being treated unfairly, whether by an HOA or any other authority. The garden wall still stands, stronger than ever, a physical reminder of the whole experience. I used to look at it and feel anger about what had happened. Now I look at it and feel pride. It represents not just good masonry work, but persistence, principle, and the willingness to fight for what is right. Those orange snow stakes that caused so much trouble became a symbol in the neighborhood. Other homeowners started using them, and they became almost a badge of honor, a quiet form of resistance against petty authority. Years later, when I think about my time in Pinecrest Meadows, the HOA drama is not what I remember most. I remember the good neighbors who became friends, the beautiful Colorado sunsets over the mountains, the sound of kids playing in the street on summer evenings, the satisfaction of maintaining a home I was proud of. The conflict with Brenda was just one chapter, albeit an intense one, in a larger story of building a life in a new place. But I would be lying if I said there was not a part of me that enjoys telling the story at parties or when the subject of HOAs comes up in conversation. Let me tell you about the time my HOA Karen removed my snow stakes, I will say, and then launch into the tale. It has become a good story, one with clear villains and heroes, conflict and resolution, justice and vindication. It is the kind of story people love to hear, because it is about the little guy standing up to petty tyranny and winning. And in a world where it often feels like the little guy doesn't win, where bureaucracy and arbitrary authority grind people down, where fighting back seems futile, maybe that is why the story resonates. Because it proves that sometimes, if you are willing to stand your ground, document everything, find good help, and see it through to the end, you can win. The system can work. Justice can prevail. And Karens, even HOA Karens with the full weight of covenants and bylaws behind them, can be held accountable for their actions. That is the real lesson I took away from the whole experience. Not anything specific about HOA law or insurance claims or civil procedure, but something more fundamental. That you have to be willing to fight for what matters to you, even when the fight is difficult, expensive, and uncertain. Because if you do not fight, you have already lost. And if you do fight, really fight with everything you have, you might just win. And even if you do not win in the end, you will know that you stood up for yourself and did not just roll over when authority overreached. So when I left Pinecrest Meadows for the last time, heading off to a new chapter in Phoenix, I took that lesson with me. I took the memory of that garden wall, rebuilt and standing strong. I took the satisfaction of having faced down someone who abused their power and coming out on top. And I took the knowledge that sometimes the most important battles are the small ones, the ones that seem petty or insignificant to others, but that represent something larger. The right to be left alone on your own property, the right to be treated fairly, the right to not be bullied by people who have a little bit of power and no idea how to use it responsibly. As I merged onto I-25 heading south, I glanced in the rearview mirror one last time at the neighborhood receding behind me. Somewhere in there was my old house with its beautiful garden wall, its carefully marked driveway, its proud defiance of petty tyranny. I smiled, turned up the radio, and drove toward whatever came next, knowing that whatever challenges lay ahead, I had proven to myself that I could handle them. The great HOA war, as my neighbors had jokingly called it, was over, and I had won.